This day has flown by for me. I can't believe it's already afternoon even. So again, this is the last talk of the day. And after this, we'll have group discussion. I hope you'll stick around for that, or that you'll go visit the dormant tree ID workshop down the hall. That's a chance. And if you have sort of reached your limit of verbal information at this point in the day, it's a chance to just go and have some hands-on tree time down the hall. The discussions, I'll go over this when we do this, but it really is, I've got different ideas in terms of topics, and I was thinking that we'd have like each table would have a separate topic that that people could go to. You could choose your table and you could go sit there and talk about any particular thing. So be thinking about if there are any particular topics that you would like to discuss, either from the meeting or if there's something that we haven't talked about today. Just be mulling that over. I've got some ideas. I have sort of suggested topics, but I don't want to necessarily stick to what I think is the right thing for you to talk about. So be thinking of what you'd like to be discussing. So starting this past summer and into the fall of this year, or last year, 2025, I had the privilege to work with two amazing UVM students from the Rubenstein School on some riparian monitoring. So my past job was working as a project manager with the Friends of the Winooski River. We would plant trees, do what you all are very familiar with, plant trees in different site conditions, and maybe do a little bit of site maintenance, but basically you let them go and you say goodbye and you wish them well. And with very little in the way of funding or time to go back and really see how things are doing in a real concerted way. You might be able to go back to a site and say, yeah, it looks okay, or yeah, this is really great, this is wonderful. But there's often not that much more time to do more than that. And I always had questions about, all kinds of questions about what variables were maybe influencing tree survivorship. So working with these two students gave me an opportunity to start to do a little bit of research. And this is very preliminary. This is just one season's worth of data, and it's messy data. These are sites that were previously planted, so we didn't necessarily set up a monitoring site at the time of planting and then follow it along. So we were just going back to old sites. And so be prepared that it's messy data and that the conclusions are very tenuous, but I think that we still learned some things. So with that caveat, I'll introduce these two great students. Julia Figueroa, over here, is a senior in wildlife and fisheries biology. She'll be graduating in May of this year with a minor in animal sciences. And I definitely witnessed her interest in animals. I mean, so she's out there supposed to, I've got her counting trees, but what, like bird, oh, dog, oh, creepy crawly thing. She's in the right place in terms of her degree. She did all the data collection over the summer that we'll be talking about. And then we've got Ben Malisheski over here. Who injured his knee on New Year's Day after fireworks, right? After fireworks display, and has been on crutches ever since then, down to one crutch rather than two. So there's some progress. But Ben is a junior pursuing a double major in forestry and environmental science. He's concentrating in conservation biology and biodiversity, and he's getting a minor in geospatial technology. So he's got like a major, he's loading it on to himself. He'll graduate in 2028, and he's interested in ecological restoration. And he volunteered his time. So Julia worked as a perennial intern, so she got a modest stipend to do the data collection work. Ben has been volunteering his time to help us crunch those numbers and make sense of them. So I really appreciate his time. This is in addition to so many other things that he's doing. And I'm really grateful to him because I never had a statistics class, and somehow I got through with my whole education without doing that. I have a PhD, and I don't have any statistics. So anyway, so he knows more statistics than me, so he's been able to help me with that. And then this is Frodo. If you haven't met him yet, every time Ben comes into my office, I get to have Frodo there, and it's very nice. Again, why did we start this? Why did we do this? I feel like even though we have been doing some monitoring, a lot of it has been overall species survivorship, total site survivorship rather than survivorship by species. And so, it always seems to me that there is this sort of idea that certain species are doing better. You know, if I were to poll this group, I would imagine people would say speckled alder, white pine, balsam poplar. We all have our favorite species, and Mandy Fisher from Intervale calls it the species du jour, because I think she has seen that things change in terms of what people really like to plant, and that for a while we might think that one species in particular is deer resistant or whatever, and then find out, nope, the deer like that too. So I wanted to begin to look at this a little bit more carefully, and since I had the opportunity to work with students to collect data and analyze it, I thought it would be a good way to start to look at this in a little bit more of a concerted way. And even though I know a lot of you have been doing some monitoring, I don't know of any, and you can tell me I'm wrong about this, but I feel like the one study that's been documented is one that Leah Safransky did from 2008 to 2011. It's an actual paper that she put out, and I can show you to just make sure you believe me. Oops. So if you haven't read this is Leah Safransky's report, and I have a link to that. I have a link to that on the Watershed Forestry website if you haven't read this. So she went out and looked at a lot of different stuff. So she had 4 years of data collection, again, from 2008 to 2011. She went to 27 previously planted sites and collected data on 1,500 trees. And she had a lot of interests that she was looking at all at the same time. So growth, vigor, survivorship by several different variables: species, site, and plant material type, whether bare root or container, and also plant protection strategies like tree tubes and mats. And at the same time, she was doing bird counts on all these sites. So she was trying to collect a lot of data at each site. And these are the issues that she herself talks about in the report. Trying to document too many variables made it such that she was not able to count as many trees as she probably would have liked to in the end. And so because of that, didn't have enough individuals of each species to really to do any kind of statistics. So if you've planted 10 paper birch on a site, and you only have 5 that are surviving, you can't really do too much in the way of statistics on those. Okay, and you're not supposed to read this, don't worry. This is, Leah moved on, and I'll speak for the Fish and Wildlife folks that there's always been that interest to follow up on that study and do more monitoring on sites to determine that question of survivorship by species, and not only survivorship, but maybe vigor as well, growth. So some of you may have met Justin Minot back in 2024. He was hired, and he tasked himself with coming up with a more streamlined monitoring protocol, and that's what you see here. This is just to show you that it really exists. Making that protocol that Leah was using a little bit more streamlined so that it was more labor efficient. So again, the focus, rather than being on a whole smattering of things, is a little bit more laser focused, just looking at tree survivorship and growth by species. And he came up with 3 different ways of doing this. So there's 3 options in the protocol. One is to monitor sites where you incorporate the monitoring from the very beginning, so you really know exactly where you put every single tree. And so you know, okay, this is the site where we put a speckled alder, and here's this, here's this the paper birch or whatever, so that you really know where everything is, and you can go back the following years and really track it one individual at a time. And then the second protocol is for cases where you might have planted, but you didn't really necessarily think of the monitoring when you put the trees in, but you still want to track things over time, so there's that option. And that would be a case where you're not really quite sure what was initially planting there. So that would be a case where you have a point in time that you create, and then you carry that on from there. And then the third would be an option where you plant this, you know what was planted there, but you didn't necessarily locate each individual on the site. But you're sure what was put in there. And so I wanted to try out the third option, and because I had all these sites that I had been the project manager on with Friends of the Winooski, and so I thought we could go back to those sites. I know what was planted there, and like a little bit of foreshadowing, not. And so we could take these cases where I thought that we knew what was put in, and we could use that information to figure out what kind of survivorship we got per species on those sites. Okay, so luckily I was able. So this position, I'm not supposed to go and actually collect data myself. So I was really grateful to Julia and to Ben for helping me with this project. I'm going to turn it over to Julia now so that she can talk to you about what she did. I pretty much just tasked her to create a Survey 123 app based on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife protocol that Justin put together. And I should say, Justin was he was hired at the wrong time, right before the federal funding and federal workforce reduction fiasco, and so he wasn't able to try this out himself. So that was another aspect of this, was that I felt like, well, maybe we could kind of help try all that out and see if it would work. So I tasked her with coming up with a Survey 123 app that was based on that protocol, and then I thought we would go out and do data collection. And at this, like a week after we started started working together, I found out that my husband needed almost immediate open heart surgery, and he's fine. But I was out of commission, dealing with that almost immediately. And so Julia just took this on and made this project her own, and did so much of this just solo. So I'll turn it over to her now, and she can tell us what she did with the data collection. And I also want to mention that we're going to bleed into the discussion session a little bit, where we're going to go over because of all of the technical difficulties we've had. So I don't want Julia or Ben to feel like you have to rush. So anyway, Julia.
Well, thank you, Shawn, for the introductions. And I just want to say that working with Shawn was really incredible this summer. She had a lot going on, but she was still an awesome supervisor. Not only did I do the monitoring over the summer, but she also gave me a lot of opportunities to get involved with the workshops, planting trees at the Intervale, doing point counts with Audubon. So I would say it was a summer well spent. So to reiterate our goals for the 2025 summer monitoring, we are essentially just trying to gauge the success of these riparian plantings, see how feasible it is to go back to these old sites and do monitoring. Is it even worth the time and effort and money to do this? And then also look for potential trends. Are there species that are more tasty to certain wildlife? Are some better or worse at surviving under like invasive or competing vegetation conditions? So these were just the things that we were keeping in mind as we were creating this protocol, well, basing the protocol off of something else created, and going out into the field to collect this data. So data was collected at 5 sites within the Winooski watershed. As you can see, the little points on the map there correspond with the colors on the side, give you little information about the buffer size, the year initially planted, and the number of stems initially planted. All of these sites, with the exception of Camel's Home State Park, received supplemental plantings at some point. Some of them were just more trees, more planting, and some of them were for fixing problems, which I will get into later. Oh, here's my little video. I hope it works. I'm gonna see. Okay, so here is the ArcGIS Survey 123 survey that I created. This is me going through the survey now. I actually did this yesterday. So as you can see, it collects all sorts of things. You can also take a photo. It does like location photo. I did not do a photo because you would just see me on my computer in the library. And then species included are a variety of species I found in the planting plans, but there's also an option you can put other species as well. Natural regeneration was not included as a category when I was monitoring over the summer. I didn't include it in this survey specifically because I think it would be good to take going forward, but it was not taken reliably over the summer. It's good to note. So, as I said, I literally changed the survey yesterday as well. But over the summer, it underwent a number of different changes. Vigor score went from either thriving or not thriving to a 0 to 5 scale. And then when Shawn, Ben, and I were practicing this presentation, I was like, oh, well, I wish I had made it a smaller scale because to limit subjectivity. And then I was like, I don't have to wish, I could just change it myself. So it's important to note that Ben was working with 0 to 5, a 0 to 5 scale, but I just recently changed it, so we're always undergoing improvements. We also changed from a 5-foot height threshold to exact stem height measurements because we realized we had some money, so we bought a measuring stick. And we also had various invasive and competing herbaceous species that I just kind of kept adding to the list as the field season went on. And this survey on ArcGIS is available for anyone to use. You can either use it directly or make a copy and make your own adaptations to it. But feel free to see me or see Shawn if that's something you'd be interested in seeing. And then in terms of the monitoring methodology, this is an example of one of the planting plans that we use to locate the buffer area and conduct the surveys. I had no information on location of stems, where anything was planted. We essentially just found the buffer, and then within the buffer, I walked the width back and forth, and I did that for the entire length of the buffer. So total inventory was conducted. We decided to do this as opposed to a transect or quadrant survey just because our margin of error was already pretty large, not knowing anything about where the trees were planted. So we figured try to get all of the stems that we could as we encountered. And yeah, that's pretty much, this is actually Interbelt Acres. This is a good example of a planting map to have because I only surveyed the left-hand strip, the 1.14 acres there. That was the only part surveyed, and then we kind of just scaled the data down to say okay, that's probably how many trees were present there. So that's also important to note for the data analysis. So challenges with the monitoring methodology. I did not have any year 0 data, so again, I'm just kind of going out there looking for trees, documenting them as I bumped into them. So naturally, that can definitely skew results. There's also plenty of human error between misidentification, or like I said with natural regeneration, I was not always very consistent about natural regeneration and documenting that, especially because without year zero data, there's really no way to prove whether or not it is a naturally regenerated stem. So I would say those were the biggest sources of human error. And now that you've been adequately forewarned about the quality of this data, I'll turn it over to Ben to give you some results that he got from crunching numbers.
All right. Thank you, Julia. So I'm going to start with a brief talk about how I analyzed the data. To be able to compare across the binary thriving or not thriving compared to the 0 to 5 vigor score, I had to convert the vigor score back to a binary system, so anything that was a 4 or 5 was considered thriving, 1 to 3 was not thriving, and a vigor of 0 was dead. Also, I had to consider any stem that wasn't found during the survey dead. Obviously, this is going to underestimate the survivorship, but I couldn't really assume any proportions of those, whether they were alive or not. In addition, as Julia mentioned, there were different aged plantings within sites, and because we didn't really know which individuals belonged to which plantings, I can't really differentiate that. This reduces confidence in any analysis within any given site. Also, planting ages varied across sites, so this makes it harder to compare site to site. We ran into a similar issue with sample sizes that Leah Safransky did. Any species that had fewer than 10 planted individuals, we couldn't count for survivorship analysis, and any species with fewer than 10 survivors at a site weren't able to be considered for a health analysis. And we also only ended up with 5 sites, so cross-site analysis is unreliable. Given all of the problems we've mentioned, and after consulting with Noelia, who presented earlier, I decided that the best test for this would be a chi-squared test for independence. This basically just tests whether or not 2 variables are related, but doesn't tell us much more than that. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with p, I've noticed a lot of, we've had p-values thrown around before in the earlier talks, but anything below 0.05 is generally considered significant. Finally, as Julia mentioned, due to a lack of confidence in distinguishing between some species, notably paper and gray birch, silky and red osier dogwood, and the willow species, in any sites where multiples of those were present, I just binned them to the species level, or to the genus level. So I'll run through these graphs fairly quickly. You don't need to worry about keeping track of all of it, but if you do want to follow a species, they are color-coded and standardized across all the graphs. So for the survivorship graphs, the left side shows the distribution of stems that were planted, and the right side shows the distribution of those that were found in the survey. At Anderbell, we had a total of 50% site-wide survivorship after between 1 and 3 years, and we can see that it was quite significant between species. For the health graphs, the left side shows those that the distribution of stems that were still alive, and the right side shows the distribution of those that were healthy. Once again, I had to cut any species that had fewer than 10 survivors. So at Anderbell, we had 55% of the survivors thriving with a p-value less than 0.01. At Camel's Hump, we had 40% site-wide survivorship after 7 years, and of those, 65% are thriving. However, with only a p-value of only 0.08, this one is less significant in terms of health varying by species. We didn't have a ton of data, so this could still be an important trend. We just need more. At the Jericho Underhill Land Trust, after 1 year, there was only 17% total survivorship. But of those, the 68% are thriving. This is the second lowest survivorship of our sites, but the second highest, third highest health. At the Rapay Adams site, we only had 14% survivorship, which is the lowest, and this actually only accounted for 21 total individuals. Of those, only Eastern White Pine had at least 10 survivors, so I couldn't do a health analysis by species, but 72% of the survivors were thriving. And finally, at the Richmond Volunteers Green, after between 5 years to less than 1 year, some of these were just planted in the spring of 2025, The 54% of the stems were still alive, and 90% of the survivors are thriving. Interestingly here, though, we have a p-value for the whole data set of less than 0.01, but if we remove paper birch as an outlier, that jumps all the way to 0.59, so this shows that the health of all those species except paper birch is roughly even. So, to compare across sites, species across sites, I used a composite score between survivorship and thriving proportions. So the composite percentage is just equal to percent survivorship times percent thriving. You can see that in the bottom left here. The table shows the top 3 species at each site. The American elm at the Richmond Volunteers Green were provided by the Nature Conservancy. Shawn mentioned that they are to be inoculated with the fungus coming up. So good luck to them. Yeah, there's a wide variation in the species that are doing the best at each site. Only eastern white pine and nannyberry are in the top 3 at more than one site. Also, to address quickly one of the reasons we need better data, you can see the chokecherry at the Richmond Volunteers Green here has a listed 105% survivorship. That's obviously not possible. We don't really know what caused this error. There's a couple of potential sources, but what it means is we recorded more chokecherries alive than were on the original planting plan. Was this natural regeneration, methodification, and an incomplete planting plan? We simply don't know. For the bottom 3 species at each site, there was a lot more overlap between the sites. You can see here the highlighted ones are present in the bottom 3 at more than one site. This uses the same composite score. Also, I think it's worth noting at the Jericho Underhill Land Trust, the tamarack there, Shawn and I did return in October, and we did find one tamarack, and it was very hard to find in the reeds. So there probably is more there, we just don't know. Okay, so overall, success of species varied very significantly both across and within sites. 8 species were in both the top 3 at one site and the bottom 3 at another site. So clearly something's going on here. We need more monitoring to try and figure out what's doing well, where, and why. And obviously this will take money, so hopefully this will inspire funders to sponsor more funding, or more monitoring. And with that, I'll turn it back to Julia briefly for her recommendations.
Thank you. Okay, I have a couple sob stories from the field, so buckle up. I don't have a photo of it, but as I previously alluded to, the Anderville site did receive a supplemental planting because it got partially mowed. So unfortunately, that's something that happened there. At Camel's Hump State Park, as you can see, there are tree tubes on the trees that are not serving the trees anymore. Some backstory to that is Camel's Hump was planted in 2018 by the Friends of the Winooski without any tree tubes or cages, but it is Vermont state land, so it's entirely possible some entity could have come in there and said, oh, we'll help you out and put tree tubes on. But then there was no communication about the tree tubes, and they stayed on for 8 years. So shout out to the Intervale crew because they came in over the summer and they took off the tree tubes and the cages to the best of their ability. But the tubes were either starting to strangle the trees because the trees were doing so well that they outgrew them, or because of the flooding that's happened over the past few years, they were filled with sediment and then also buried. So unfortunately, that did have an impact on the site. And then Jericho Underhill Land Trust, this happened after I monitored, but they did also partially mow Jericho, which already wasn't doing too hot. It will be replanted, and that will be the owner's expense. So that's good at least, but it's very unfortunate that the mowings happen and that things that could have been preventable are kind of hindering the success. which leads me to kind of a conclusion, not statistically backed, but a conclusion that Shawn and I weren't really looking for. It wasn't really at the forefront of our minds. But is human-caused mortality a major factor hindering riparian restoration success? I took data on like deer browse and rodent damage, and it was definitely present. It definitely had an effect as just observationally, but it kind of kept coming up that the biggest thing that was destroying these projects to a certain level was caused by humans, which kind of leads me into my recommendations for future planting and monitoring. Let's see. So, communication and documentation, having a point person per site or per project would definitely help with keeping all the information, documentation, whether it's like records for what plants were bought, what years they were planted, communication in terms of between like project partners and funders, even just to have someone who is in charge of the project and can call up a landowner and say, oh, it's about that time of year where we're mowing and we're brush hogging. Just a reminder, don't run over the plants. Make sure to avoid that area. That would definitely help with the success of these sites. Going off of that, stem protection and maintenance. We did talk a little bit, I heard a little bit about flagging the trees. Definitely very important because they start out so small. And definitely also putting on tree tubes only if you know that you have the funding to then take them off after they've served their purpose. All these things, not done with malicious intent, not anyone's fault in particular, but just something that could definitely be avoided with some streamlined communication. And then finally, I do think that monitoring these sites is definitely feasible if you collect year zero data. I think that was the biggest takeaway for me for like at the site level. I think that if you had the location of the stems and the species exactly when they're put in the ground, that would be huge in terms of being able to go back and monitor. You could even just do a transect. You don't have to do the whole thing. And then you can also track, by species, how trees are doing and how successful you are. Also, I do wish that I had taken more information on the site conditions as like just a whole, whether it's like soil conditions or topography, or the general like natural community there, because there was a lot of variation between sites. I remember going to Camel's Hump and seeing speckled alder and expecting it to look so good, and then I got there and it looked terrible, but then it looked great in so many other places. Same thing with meadow vole damage. I really didn't see it except for the Anderbell site. So not only for the success of the trees, but also maybe what wildlife is attracted to the area, it would be good to take more information on the sites. And so those are my recommendations at the site level. I'll turn it back over to Ben to talk a little bit about analysis recommendations.
Okay. So I have two major takeaways that I'd like to see improved. First of all, standardization of a monitoring protocol across organizations and throughout multiple years would build a much larger and therefore stronger data set. And this would practically remove any issues with sample sizes. It could still happen at the site level, but for the most part, that would remove it. In addition, if we had strong year zero data, we could do sampling instead of a full census of a site without sacrificing pretty much any statistical power. The problem with the reason we had to do a census is because we didn't know where anything was, so we couldn't properly sample it. But if we could do a sample, that would significantly reduce the time that it takes to monitor and also therefore, of course, the cost.
All right, thank you, Ben. Thank you, Julia. So I just want to reiterate some of the stories that we just heard, or tell my side of the story, I guess. Because, of course, I feel a little defensive about these. I mean, some of these are sites that I was a project manager on. The Camel's Hump site, just so that you know the whole story, This was a site that the Friends of the Winooski planted, and that was on state land, and so we requested, permission to do this. This is right along the Long Trail where it parallels the Winooski River, and so we got permission from the manager of the Camel's Hump State Park that we could plant there, and I thought I was the point person. That it was my planting. You know how you get sort of possessive. I thought it was my planting, and I was the one who ordered the trees and got the volunteers and funding and everything lined up to do this project. Planted the trees, and again, this was a case where I had to plant and then sort of walk away. I didn't have a lot of time because you're always developing new projects and you have other programs that you're managing. So I wasn't able to go back to take a look, and I didn't know that somebody else was going to go and put tree tubes on it and not tell me. So I don't know where those tree tubes came from. Somebody decided that they were needed, and at some point put them on. And I did, since it's right along the Long Trail, I had gone back to walk along there to sort of see how things were doing. At the time, there was no tubes on there, and I thought, okay, it looks pretty good, so I can kind of check that off and say, I think that one's good to sort of take care of itself. And then 8 years later, come and find that the tubes are just, the trees are bursting out of these tree tubes, and that and there's fungus growing on the bark underneath, and not only that, but they're buried in sediment. You can't just yank them off anymore. They're on there. And so when the intervale went to go take them off, they had to cut along the ground line, but there's still tree tube underneath there. So I don't know how those trees are going to do, and they were looking so good. So I feel like Julia's point about having one point person who everybody who's partnering knows that this person needs to know everything that goes on that site, just so that there's at least one person who kind of has that bird's eye view and knows what's going on, I think is really important. And then the mowing thing, I guess I'll also say that something similar happened on one of the other sites. So we're only looking at 5 sites, and another site also had, multiple partners working, and I think each one thought that they were the planting person. And I thought I think somebody, another partner thought that that was their planting. And I wasn't getting information from the other partner about what was going on there. So they decided that some more trees needed to be planted and didn't tell me that there was more trees on that site. And so Julia gets out there and starts saying, well, there's all these trees that are not on the planting plan. And so where did these, and they were very clearly planted, and I'm thinking, where do these come from? They just kind of appear there. And so, I contacted other people who who had been partners on the project and said, did you plant more trees there? Oh, yeah, we put in another 500 trees. So it's, that, again, we just need to, there needs to be a point person, and where there's an understanding that all the partners are talking to each other. And, granted, most of these projects, it doesn't matter. We're not going to go back and monitor every single one. And so I think there's this understanding that there can be a lot of mess. I mean, it can be chaotic, and what's the harm of putting an extra 500 trees on a site? But if we are going back to do any monitoring, of course, we need to know if there's extra trees planted. And then the mowing again too. I mean, this has happened to so many of the sites that I've been engaged in. We put, witness trees along the edge. We put big, yellow or orange or white flags out on the edge, and they get ignored. And so again, it's not necessarily the landowner; it's somebody else who's comes in to hay that property. So again, I think the communication thing is just making sure that everybody who's touching that land in some way or another is aware of the buffer and knows not to mow it down. Two out of the 5 sites had problems with tree tubes. 2 out of the 5 sites had trouble with humans mowing them down. So that's why Julia and I decided that humans were topped deer in terms of causes of mortality. Okay, so clearly talk a little bit about what's next. I would like to continue doing monitoring on these same sites if possible, and see how these trees continue to do. I thought it was really interesting to go back to sites that were I think, well, we have one that's 10 years, the Rape Adams, the one that has the really low, 11 years old. So it was just kind of fun to go back to a site that's that old and see, and I will say that, we had only 14% of survivorship, but we didn't count natural regen, and there was a lot, and granted, some of it was black locust, but it didn't look as bad as you would expect. In fact, I have a picture of two of these sites. So on the right there is the pre-planting at the Rape Edom site where we had just very low survivorship. So there was nothing there. It was just mowed grass beforehand. And we rototilled it and planted it. And then, and this is what it looks like now. So we don't have great tree survivorship, but there's some nice perennials in there. You can't really tell. But there's goldenrod and Joe Pyeweed and boneset, and so it's not I wouldn't call that a failure. It's still doing something better than what it was doing before, even though we might not have the tree survivorship that we would have liked. So again, I mean, this has been a theme in other talks as well, is maybe percent survivorship is not necessarily the only metric that we want to be using when we talk about success of a planting. And some of those trees were really quite large after 10 years, and it was really cool to see those. And I have pictures from the Richmond Volunteers Green. That's where we had partners that were planting trees without telling me about it. But that's just to show you what that looks like. And that one has 50% survivorship. But I think we actually have better. It's better than what that sounds like, because there's one end of that site that is just full of bindweed, and so that end is pretty much 100% mortality. The bindweed just took everything down, but this part actually has much higher survivorship. So again, there's more to the story than just the survivorship number. Julie already talked to you about those. So the Jericho Underhill mowing and the Camel's Hump tree tube fiasco, but just another picture of a tree outgrowing its tree tube and buried. You can't really tell, but there's like a foot of sediment that's got that tree tube buried. I guess I'll go back just really quick to this. So I'd like to also do, like Julia and Ben suggested, doing some long-term monitoring plots where we're really starting at day one. So day of planting, we record where those individual trees are going and what species they are, and follow them along. And again, we would track by species and vigor, growth, and also look at I'm really interested in just this idea of this spot sparing versus string trimming. That would be an interesting thing to look at. And again, looking a little bit more at site conditions, since we know now that, from Ben's analysis and Julia's data collection, that it does seem that there is this very clear connection between, things are there. We don't know what species are necessarily the best ones for each site, but we do know that there is a correlation between site and species that are surviving there. So learning a little bit more about that, I think, would be very interesting. And so I just want to end by thanking both Ben and Julia for their help with this work. And I wish that Julia was going to stick around and that I could have her do more of this work next summer. But I'm hoping that we can continue to collect data and continue this kind of analysis. And I want to also reiterate that Survey 123 app is something that I'm hoping we can share. And to Ben's point about having everybody use a similar monitoring protocol, I think would be really cool. We'd be able to really compare all of our sites and do some really ask some interesting questions.